The abandoned storage unit held a secret so shocking that a Broke Mountain veteran discovered he'd been living a lie for 55 years. Broke Mountain man found abandoned storage unit. What his dog uncovered inside changed his life. High in the snow-covered San Juan Mountains, former Navy SEAL Mason Reed believed the world had forgotten him. With only his loyal German shepherd, Shadow, by his side, he survived one lonely day at a time. But when Shadow became obsessed with an abandoned storage unit hidden behind a ghost mining camp, he uncovered something impossible. Letters, photographs, and a family secret powerful enough to rewrite Mason's entire life. Comment 1 if you'd follow your dog's instincts, or 0 if you'd walk away. And tell us where you're watching from. The San Juan Mountains rose like ancient stone giants against the pale Colorado sky, their snow-dusted peaks catching the first light of dawn. In late October, winter already lingered in the shadows. Frost covered the ground. Pine branches sagged beneath a thin layer of ice. The world seemed frozen in a quiet that most people would have found unsettling. For Mason Reed, it felt normal. The 61-year-old former Navy SEAL stood outside a weather-beaten hunting cabin, tucked deep inside a remote valley. The structure leaned slightly to one side, as if the mountain itself was slowly reclaiming it. Smoke curled lazily from a rusted chimney. The windows were cloudy with age. Half the roof had been patched with mismatched sheets of metal scavenged from abandoned ranch buildings. It wasn't much, but it was home. Mason stepped onto the porch carrying an armload of firewood. His broad shoulders still hinted at the powerful operator he had once been, though age and hardship had carved deep lines into his face. Gray threaded through his beard. Old injuries stiffened his movements when the cold settled into his bones. A sharp wind swept down from the mountains. Mason barely noticed. The nightmares had been worse than usual. Again. He dropped the wood beside the door and rubbed tired eyes. He had slept maybe 2 hours. The dream always came back. Desert sand, gunfire, a helicopter burning in the darkness, voices calling names that no longer answered. Then silence. The kind of silence that haunted a man long after the battle ended. A familiar sound interrupted his thoughts. A low bark. Mason glanced toward the cabin doorway. Shadow emerged from inside. The German shepherd moved with quiet confidence despite being nearly 10 years old. His black and tan coat gleamed in the morning light. Intelligent brown eyes studied Mason with the calm vigilance that had once made him one of the Navy's finest military working dogs. "You hungry?" Mason asked. Shadow's tail thumped once. The dog followed him into the cabin. Inside, the space was simple. A cast-iron stove, a narrow bed, shelves filled with survival gear, military photographs tucked into corners. The scent of wood smoke lingered in the air. Mason opened a cabinet and stared at the contents. 1 can of beans, half a loaf of bread, a few strips of dried venison. Not much else. He sighed. Money had been running out for months. The old truck parked behind the cabin hadn't started in nearly a year. His occasional repair jobs for distant ranchers had dried up after last winter's heavy storms. The nearest town sat 30 miles away. These days, he mostly survived by hunting, fishing, and stretching every dollar until it nearly broke. Mason opened a bag of premium dog food. Only a few servings remained. He poured a generous portion into Shadow's bowl. The dog immediately sat, waiting, disciplined, patient, still following commands years after retirement. Mason smiled faintly. "Go ahead." Shadow began eating. Mason tore a small piece from the stale bread and sat near the stove. It wasn't enough, not even close, but he had long ago stopped caring much about himself. Shadow was different. Shadow mattered. The dog had saved his life more times than he could count. Some during combat, some after. Especially after. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling fire. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines. Most people assumed loneliness was loud. Mason knew better. Real loneliness was quiet. It sat beside you while you drank coffee. It followed you through empty rooms. It waited patiently during every sunset. And eventually, it became part of who you were. Years ago, people had tried to help. Therapists, veterans organizations, old teammates, neighbors. Mason had pushed them all away, every one of them. The fewer people around, the fewer people he could lose. That logic had made perfect sense to him, at least at first. Now he wasn't so sure. Shadow finished eating and approached. The dog rested his head on Mason's knee. Mason scratched behind his ears. The shepherd closed his eyes contentedly. "You know something, buddy?" Shadow looked up. "You're about the only reason I still get out of bed." The dog gave a soft grunt, as if he understood. Maybe he did. The bond between them went beyond words. They had endured too much together. Years earlier, Mason had adopted Shadow after the dog's military retirement. Most handlers moved on after service. Mason couldn't. The shepherd had carried scars of his own. Together they had learned how to survive life after war. Outside, clouds gathered around distant peaks. Another storm was coming. Winter moved fast in these mountains. By noon, Mason grabbed an axe and stepped outside. "We need more firewood." Shadow immediately rose. Ready. Always ready. The trail leading away from the cabin wound through dense pine forests and rocky slopes. Golden aspens shimmered between darker evergreens. Fallen leaves crunched beneath Mason's boots. Shadow ranged ahead, nose working, ears alert, occasionally glancing back to check on his human. The mountain wilderness stretched endlessly around them, beautiful, unforgiving, free. Mason preferred it that way. Hours passed. They collected fallen timber from a ridge overlooking an abandoned silver mining settlement. The old buildings sat silent below, half swallowed by nature. Most locals avoided the place. Too isolated, too forgotten. Just the way Mason liked things. He paused to catch his breath. Age had a way of reminding a man that time was undefeated. Shadow stood nearby, staring toward the abandoned structures. Mason noticed. The dog rarely stared at anything for long, yet now he remained perfectly still, focused, watching. "What is it?" Shadow didn't move. His ears stood upright. Every muscle tightened. The old soldier's instincts surfaced immediately. Something had caught the dog's attention. Something important. Mason followed Shadow's gaze toward the far edge of the settlement. The abandoned buildings cast long shadows beneath the afternoon sun. Broken windows reflected flashes of light. Nothing unusual, at least not that he could see. After a moment, Shadow relaxed. The tension faded. The dog turned back toward Mason. Whatever had drawn his attention seemed gone. For now. But something about the moment lingered. An uneasiness Mason couldn't explain. As they started back toward the cabin, dark clouds rolled over the peaks. Snow began falling. Only a few flakes at first, then more. Shadow stayed unusually close during the hike home. Twice he stopped and looked back toward the mining settlement. Twice Mason noticed, and twice a strange feeling settled in his chest. Not fear, not exactly. More like anticipation. The kind he used to feel before missions, before everything changed. That night, the storm arrived. Wind battered the cabin walls. Snow piled against the windows. The mountains disappeared beneath darkness. Mason sat beside the fire while Shadow slept nearby. For a long time, he stared into the flames, watching memories flicker inside them. Friends lost. Years wasted. A life reduced to survival. Eventually he stood and checked the cabin door. Locked. Secure. Shadow suddenly lifted his head. Alert. The dog stared toward the window, listening, watching. Mason frowned. "What is it, boy?" Shadow remained motionless. Outside, the storm howled. Then the dog slowly lowered his head again. Whatever had disturbed him was gone. Mason returned to his chair. Yet sleep didn't come. Somewhere beyond the storm, beyond the forest, beyond the forgotten mining camp, something had begun moving toward them. Neither man nor dog knew it yet, but the life Mason Reed thought was finished was about to change forever. And it would begin because one loyal German shepherd refused to ignore what everyone else had forgotten. The storm raged through most of the night. Snow hammered the cabin roof. Wind screamed across the mountains like a living thing. Mason eventually drifted into a restless sleep beside the stove, wrapped in an old military blanket, while Shadow remained stretched near the front door. Just before dawn, the nightmare returned. A desert village, a radio crackling with broken voices, a teammate shouting for help. Then silence. Mason woke with a sharp gasp. His pulse thundered in his ears. For a few seconds, he wasn't in Colorado. He was back overseas, back in the heat, back in the chaos. Shadow was immediately beside him. The German shepherd nudged his hand, grounding him, pulling him back. "It's okay," Mason muttered. His voice sounded tired, old. The dog remained close until Mason's breathing slowed. Only then did Shadow step away. Outside, the storm had passed. The world was white. Fresh snow blanketed the mountains. The sky glowed pale blue above the peaks. For most people, it would have looked beautiful. For Mason, it meant work. Winter never cared about beauty. Winter cared about preparation. He spent the morning clearing snow from around the cabin, repairing a section of fence, checking firewood supplies. Shadow followed him everywhere. But something was different. The dog seemed distracted. Twice he stopped working his normal patrol routes around the property. Twice he stared toward the distant mining settlement. Mason noticed. The behavior bothered him. Shadow rarely acted without reason. Military working dogs weren't trained to waste energy. Everything had a purpose. Everything meant something. By noon, Mason loaded a rope, axe, and small backpack. More firewood was needed before the next storm arrived. Shadow immediately moved ahead on the trail. The same trail they had walked the previous day. The same trail leading toward the abandoned silver mining camp. The forest felt different after fresh snowfall. Every branch glittered. Every sound seemed sharper. The mountains stood silent beneath endless white. Mason found himself admiring the view despite everything. Colorado still had a way of surprising him, even after all these years. They reached the ridge overlooking the old settlement shortly after noon. Weathered buildings sat scattered among the trees. Collapsed roofs, broken windows, rusting machinery, remnants of a forgotten era. Nature was slowly erasing every trace of human ambition. Mason paused. Shadow did not. The shepherd immediately became alert. His body stiffened. His ears rose. Then he took off. "Shadow!" The dog ignored him. Mason frowned. That almost never happened. The German shepherd raced downhill toward the settlement. Snow flew behind him. His movements carried urgency, purpose. Mason followed. His boots slipped on the frozen slope. The years were beginning to catch up with him. But Shadow was already disappearing between the abandoned structures. By the time Mason reached the camp, he was breathing hard. "Shadow!" A bark answered. Then another. Mason followed the sound around an old maintenance building. What he found stopped him cold. Shadow stood beside a rusted storage unit tucked behind a row of collapsed sheds. The structure was almost invisible beneath overgrown brush and years of neglect. Snow covered most of the roof, Rust stained the metal walls. The faded blue paint had nearly disappeared. Mason had explored this settlement dozens of times over the years, yet somehow he had never noticed it. The storage unit sat hidden in a small depression surrounded by pine trees, as if the mountain itself had been concealing it. Shadow was scratching furiously at the metal door. His claws scraped against steel. His barking echoed through the empty settlement. "What are you doing?" The dog continued. "Scratch, scratch, scratch." Mason approached. The old unit appeared abandoned. Nothing unusual, nothing obvious. Yet Shadow refused to stop. The shepherd whined, then pawed the door again. More urgently this time, almost desperately. Mason examined the structure. The original lock had long since disappeared. A broken chain hung loosely from the handle. Rust streaks ran down the metal. The place looked untouched for years, maybe decades. Still, something about it felt strange. The sensation was difficult to explain. Not danger, not exactly. More like being watched by history itself. Shadow barked again, louder. Then something unexpected happened. The dog threw his shoulder against the door, hard. The metal rattled. He did it again, and again, until he stumbled backward. "Easy!" Mason grabbed his collar. The shepherd resisted, trying to reach the door, trying to return, trying to show him something. Mason stared into the dog's eyes, the same eyes that had warned him about danger during deployments, the same eyes that had saved his life more than once. Trust wasn't something built overnight. It was earned, and Shadow had earned it. If the dog believed something mattered behind that door, maybe it did. Mason released a long breath. All right. Shadow immediately sat, waiting, watching. Mason stepped toward the storage unit. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The cold metal handle felt frozen beneath his glove. He pulled. Nothing happened. The door was stuck. Years of neglect had practically welded it shut. Mason planted his feet, pulled harder. Metal groaned. The sound echoed through the settlement. A flock of birds exploded from nearby trees. Still, the door barely moved. Shadow stood motionless, watching every second. Mason tried again, this time using all his strength. The muscles in his arms tightened. His shoulder burned. Suddenly, crack! The seal broke. The door shifted an inch. Then two. Dust and frozen debris spilled onto the snow. Shadow immediately surged forward. Mason held him back. "Wait. Old habits. Clear first. Move second." He pulled the door farther open. The hinges screamed. A blast of stale air rolled out. Cold, dry, ancient. Sunlight pushed into the darkness. For several moments, Mason couldn't make out the contents. Then shapes slowly emerged. Boxes, shelves, covered objects, tarps, furniture, storage. Not junk, not abandoned trash, organized storage. Someone had arranged everything carefully, deliberately, as if they expected to return. Shadow slipped past him. The shepherd moved inside, nose working, investigating. His excitement only grew. Mason followed more cautiously. Dust floated through beams of sunlight. The interior smelled of old paper and wood. Time seemed frozen inside. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing appeared looted. Then Mason noticed something else. No cobwebs near the entrance. No animal nests. No obvious signs of decades-long abandonment. Someone had been here. Maybe not recently, but not nearly as long ago as he first assumed. A strange chill crawled across the back of his neck. Shadow stopped near the far wall, whining softly. The dog stared toward a stack of covered boxes. Mason approached. Something about the scene felt increasingly impossible. His instincts sharpened. The same instincts that had kept him alive in combat. The same instincts telling him this wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. Shadow pawed one of the boxes, then looked directly at Mason, waiting, almost impatiently. Mason pulled away the dusty tarp. Beneath it sat several cardboard containers. Most carried faded labels, photographs, records, personal items, maps. The handwriting looked neat, careful, intentional. Mason frowned. Whoever owned this place had organized everything meticulously. Then his eyes landed on another box, a larger one, positioned in the center. Unlike the others, this box appeared newer, protected, preserved, almost important. A single name was written across the side in bold black letters. Mason froze. Every sound disappeared. Even the wind outside seemed to vanish. His heartbeat slowed, then quickened, because written clearly across the box was a name he had not expected to see. His own. Mason Reed. The letters stared back at him. Impossible. Completely impossible. Nobody knew he came here. Nobody knew he lived in these mountains. Nobody should have known where to find him. Yet somehow, someone had. Shadow sat quietly beside the box, as though his mission was finally complete. Mason stared at the name. 1,000 questions flooding his mind. And somewhere deep inside, beneath years of isolation and grief, something stirred. For the first time in a very long while, curiosity. Mason stood frozen inside the storage unit. Snow drifted lazily through the partially opened doorway behind him. Shadow sat beside the box as if guarding it, waiting. The name painted across the cardboard remained impossible to ignore. Mason Reed. His full name. Not just Mason, not Reed. Both. Written clearly by someone who knew exactly who he was. A chill moved through him that had nothing to do with the Colorado winter. "How?" he whispered. The storage unit offered no answer, only silence. The same silence that had filled these mountains for years. Mason slowly crouched beside the box. His gloved hand hovered over the cardboard. Something deep inside warned him not to open it. Another part of him desperately needed to know. Shadow nudged his arm. The shepherd's tail moved once. That simple gesture decided it. Mason cut through the tape with his hunting knife. The cardboard flaps opened. Inside lay several neatly stacked envelopes, photographs, a leather-bound journal, and one letter sitting on top. The envelope carried his name. Again. The handwriting looked careful and deliberate, not rushed, not angry, personal. Mason stared at it for several seconds before finally opening it. The paper inside crackled softly. His eyes moved across the first line. "Dear Mason, if you're reading this, then Shadow finally found what I could never deliver myself." Mason stopped breathing. His eyes returned to the sentence. Read it again. Then again. Shadow. The letter mentioned Shadow by name. His heart began pounding. Nobody knew about the dog. Nobody except a handful of ranchers and store owners in towns dozens of miles away. Yet whoever wrote this knew. Mason continued reading. "My name is Lucas Reed, and if everything I've uncovered is true, I'm your brother." The words seemed to leap from the page. Mason lowered the letter. His jaw tightened. Brother? The idea was absurd. His father had never mentioned another child. His mother had died when he was young. There had never been stories about missing relatives. No family reunions. No forgotten branches of the family tree. Nothing. He was an only child. At least that was what he had always believed. Shadow rested beside him while Mason forced himself to continue. For 18 years, I've been trying to find you. I've followed every lead, every rumor, every address. I've spent thousands of dollars and countless miles searching for my little brother. If you've reached this letter, then I finally succeeded." Mason stared at the words. 18 years. The man claimed to have searched for him for nearly 2 decades. His first instinct was suspicion. People lied. People manipulated. People wanted something, especially when property or money entered the conversation. Yet nothing about the letter felt dishonest. It felt lonely. The writer sounded like someone carrying a burden for a very long time. Mason set the letter down. His attention shifted toward the photographs. There were dozens, maybe hundreds. Old family pictures, birthday celebrations, holidays, fishing trips, school portraits, entire lives frozen inside fading pieces of paper. He picked up one near the top. A young man stood beside a pickup truck. Dark hair, broad shoulders, strong jawline. The resemblance struck him immediately. The stranger looked like an older version of himself. Not identical, but close enough to make his stomach tighten. On the back, someone had written, "Lucas Reed, Missoula, Montana." Mason swallowed. The resemblance wasn't coincidence. Not anymore. Shadow suddenly stood. The shepherd began sniffing along a nearby shelf. Mason barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on the growing pile of evidence. Another photograph, then another. Lucas at a lake. Lucas standing beside a woodworking shop. Lucas holding a fish nearly the size of his arm. Each image seemed to tell the story of a man Mason had never met, yet somehow recognized. Eventually, he opened the leather journal. The first page carried a date, 18 years earlier. Beneath it were handwritten notes. Located another Mason Reed in Idaho. Wrong man. No military background. Search continues. Mason flipped pages. Hundreds of entries followed. Every year documented. Every failed lead. Every dead end. Every new clue. The man had truly spent years searching. There were maps covered in markings, phone numbers, addresses, investigator reports, receipts, evidence of obsession or devotion, maybe both. Mason reached the middle of the journal. One entry caught his attention. Possible sighting near Durango. Former Navy SEAL. Lives alone. Owns German Shepherd. Need confirmation. His pulse quickened. That was him. The journal described him. Years before, anyone should have known where he lived. How had Lucas tracked him? Why had he cared enough to try? The questions multiplied. Outside, clouds drifted across the mountains. The afternoon light softened. Time slipped away unnoticed. For hours, Mason sat inside the storage unit reading fragments of another man's life, a life strangely connected to his own. Shadow suddenly barked. Once. Sharp. Alert. Mason looked up. The dog stood near the back wall, pawing at something hidden beneath a tarp. "What is it?" Shadow scratched again. Persistent. Focused. Mason walked over. Together they pulled aside the heavy canvas covering. Beneath it sat several old military footlockers. Green metal. Scratched and weathered. One carried faded military markings. Another had a simple label attached. Personal records. The third bore no label at all. Yet something about it felt important. Shadow refused to leave it. The dog sniffed every corner, then sat directly in front of it, waiting, almost smiling. Mason laughed quietly. The sound surprised him. He hadn't laughed much in recent years. "You really want me to open this place up, don't you?" Shadow's tail thumped. The footlocker opened with a metallic click. Inside were more folders, more documents, more photographs, and one sealed envelope, larger than the others, The front carried only 4 words. For my brother. Mason stared at it. A strange pressure settled inside his chest. Not fear. Not exactly. Something deeper. A feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he believed. The sun was beginning to set outside. Golden light filtered through cracks in the metal walls. The abandoned mining camp remained silent beyond the doorway. A forgotten place hiding forgotten truths. Mason looked at Shadow. The dog met his gaze calmly, as if he had known all along, as if this discovery had been waiting for years. And somehow, a retired military dog had been the one destined to find it. Mason gathered the letters carefully. The journal, the photographs. He wasn't ready to leave them behind. Not now, not after what he had seen. As he packed everything into his backpack, one thought echoed louder than all the others. Who was Lucas Reed? And why had he spent 18 years searching for a brother who never knew he existed? The answer waited somewhere inside the remaining letters. And for the first time since arriving in the mountains years ago, Mason found himself eager for tomorrow. Because tomorrow might finally tell him who he really was. That feeling alone was strange. For nearly a decade, Mason Reed had lived one day at a time, survive the winter, gather enough food, keep the cabin standing, take care of Shadow. Nothing beyond that mattered. The future had become something he avoided thinking about. Yet, as darkness settled over the San Juan Mountains that evening, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. The old hunting cabin seemed different somehow. The walls hadn't changed. The roof still leaked during heavy storms. The stove still rattled when the wind pushed against the chimney. But the silence felt less empty. Mason sat beside the fire with Shadow stretched across the floor nearby. The letters from Lucas Reed rested on the table, waiting. The flames cast dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, snow drifted softly through the moonlight. Inside, Mason opened the second letter. Dear Mason, if you're reading this, then you've probably already decided whether you think I'm crazy. Truthfully, I wouldn't blame you. If someone had told me 18 years ago that I had a brother I never knew existed, I would have laughed in their face. Mason leaned forward. The handwriting remained steady, confident. The voice behind the words felt increasingly real, not like a scam, not like a fantasy, like a man speaking honestly. Lucas continued. I discovered your existence after Grandma Evelyn passed away. While cleaning her house, I found an old cedar chest hidden in the attic. Inside were photographs, legal papers, and one picture of a little boy standing beside me. On the back was written, Lucas and Mason, summer of 1971. I was 8 years old. You were 6. Mason froze. His fingers tightened around the paper. Summer of 1971. 6 years old. A strange sensation moved through his chest. The age sounded important, familiar, yet frustratingly distant, like a dream disappearing the moment you woke up. He continued reading. The problem was, I didn't remember you. Not at first. Nobody had ever mentioned a younger brother. My parents were gone. Most relatives had passed away. The few who remained refused to talk about the past. That made me suspicious. The more people avoided my questions, the harder I pushed. Eventually, I uncovered the truth. And once I did, I couldn't stop looking for you. Mason lowered the page. His mind raced. Someone else hadn't remembered either. Lucas had discovered him through old photographs. Just as strange, just as impossible. Shadow lifted his head, watching. The shepherd seemed unusually attentive whenever Mason read the letters, as if he understood their importance. Perhaps he did. Dogs often understood things people missed. The fire crackled softly. Mason opened another envelope. This one was dated 17 years earlier. Dear Mason, today I drove 6 hours because a private investigator believed he'd located you in Wyoming. Wrong man. Again. But for 2 hours, I thought I might finally meet my brother. I even bought an extra coffee on the drive there. Seems silly now. I ended up drinking both myself. Mason found himself smiling slightly. The image felt oddly human, not dramatic, not grand, just a lonely man carrying hope. Letter after letter revealed the same pattern. Searches, false leads, disappointments, renewed determination. The years unfolded before him. Lucas traveled through Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona, tracking fragments of information, following rumors, chasing possibilities. One letter carried a photograph clipped to the corner. Lucas stood beside an old pickup truck. His hair showed streaks of gray. His smile looked tired. On the back he had written, Year 12. Still looking. Still believing. Mason stared at the image. Something inside him shifted. Nobody had ever searched for him before. At least not that he knew of. After leaving the Navy, he'd spent years feeling forgotten. A name in old records, a veteran among millions, a man drifting farther from the world every year. Yet somewhere out there, a stranger had spent nearly 2 decades refusing to let him disappear. The thought felt overwhelming. Around midnight, Mason opened another journal. This one contained investigator reports, carefully organized, meticulously detailed. He flipped through pages, addresses, employment records, military history, old photographs from public archives. Then he stopped. One page had been folded. A note was clipped to it. Possible match former Navy SEAL lives off-grid, Colorado Mountains accompanied by German Shepherd. Probability. High. Mason stared. His pulse quickened. Lucas had come close. Very close. Closer than he realized. He read further. Unable to locate exact residence. Locals report man avoids town. Purchases supplies every few months. Extremely private. Continued surveillance not recommended. Investigator believes subject may relocate if approached aggressively. Mason leaned back slowly. The report was only 3 years old. 3 years. Lucas had nearly found him. The realization struck harder than expected. All this time, while Mason was hiding from the world, someone had been searching. Not to hurt him, not to use him, simply to find him. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the mountains less isolated, the distance between people less absolute. Shadow rose and approached. The German Shepherd rested his head against Mason's leg. Mason scratched behind his ears absent-mindedly. You knew something was there, didn't you? Shadow's tail moved once. Mason laughed softly. The dog always seemed to know more than he should. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with him. He placed the letters neatly beside the stove, but sleep didn't come easily. Questions kept circling. Who exactly was Lucas? How were they connected? Why did nobody ever mention him? Most importantly, why couldn't Mason remember any of it? The next morning dawned clear and cold. Golden sunlight illuminated the mountains. The storm had left the world sparkling beneath fresh snow. Mason made coffee and immediately returned to the letters. He couldn't stop. The mystery had its hooks in him now. Hours passed. One letter described Lucas's woodworking business in Missoula. Another mentioned restoring an old cabin somewhere in the mountains. A third spoke about holidays spent alone. And then Mason found a letter that changed everything. The envelope looked older than the others. Worn from handling. Inside was a photograph. The image showed two young boys standing beside a wooden fence. One looked about 8, the other 6, both smiling, both wearing oversized jackets. Mason's breath caught. The younger boy looked exactly like him. Not similar, not close. Exactly. The same eyes, the same jawline, even the small scar above his left eyebrow. The scar he still carried today. His hands began to shake, because the older boy beside him could only be Lucas. The resemblance between them was undeniable. Brothers. Real brothers. For the first time, the impossible claim no longer seemed impossible. A note had been attached. I carried this picture in my wallet for 15 years. It was the only proof I had that you existed, the only proof I wasn't losing my mind. Mason stared at the photograph. Something stirred deep inside his memory. A sensation, a voice, a laugh. Gone before he could grasp it, like smoke. But it was there. For the briefest moment, a piece of the past trying to surface. Shadow suddenly barked. Once, sharp, alert. Mason looked up. The dog stood near the door, watching the forest outside, ears forward, body tense. Instinctively, Mason reached for the rifle leaning beside the wall. Years of training took over. He stepped onto the porch. The mountains remained silent. No movement. No people. Nothing. Yet Shadow continued staring toward the distant tree line. Mason followed the dog's gaze, far beyond the pines, beyond the snowy valley, toward the abandoned mining settlement, the place where all of this had begun, the place where more answers still waited. Because Lucas hadn't only left letters, there were still unopened footlockers, unopened records, unopened secrets, and somewhere among them, the truth. Mason looked down at the photograph in his hand, the image of two brothers smiling together beneath a summer sun, a life he couldn't remember, a family he never knew existed. For the first time in years, he wasn't simply surviving, he was searching, and deep down a new question had begun to grow. Not whether Lucas had been telling the truth, but whether he might still be alive. The question followed Mason through the rest of the day. It lingered while he gathered firewood, while he repaired a loose section of the cabin roof, while he prepared dinner beside the crackling stove. For 18 years, Lucas Reed had searched for him. If the most recent letters were recent enough, maybe there was still time. Maybe the story wasn't over. Maybe two brothers separated by decades could still meet. The possibility felt dangerous. Hope often was, especially for a man who had spent years avoiding it. The following morning arrived beneath clear skies. Sunlight poured across the snowy peaks. The world looked almost peaceful. Mason loaded his backpack before sunrise. The remaining boxes in the storage unit called to him. Too many questions remained unanswered. Shadow waited at the door. The shepherd seemed unusually eager. His tail moved as Mason grabbed his coat. "Back to work, huh?" Shadow barked once. The hike toward the abandoned mining settlement felt shorter this time. Mason's thoughts were elsewhere. Every step carried anticipation. Every turn in the trail seemed to bring him closer to something important. The storage unit stood exactly as they had left it. Silent. Hidden. Waiting. Shadow immediately rushed inside. His nose worked furiously, investigating every corner. Mason set down his pack and returned to the footlockers. Hours passed. Documents covered the floor. Photographs spread across makeshift piles. Old letters, receipts, maps, investigator notes. The deeper he looked, the stranger everything became. Lucas had documented nearly every year of his search, yet one thing remained noticeably absent. There were almost no details about their childhood, no explanations, no clear answers. Only hints, references, fragments, as if Lucas had deliberately withheld something. Mason noticed the pattern immediately. A former SEAL learned to spot missing pieces, and there were plenty of missing pieces here. Shadow suddenly barked. The sharp sound echoed through the storage unit. Mason looked up. The shepherd stood beside a shelving unit along the back wall, his paw scratched repeatedly at the floor beneath it. What is it now? Shadow scratched again. Harder. Persistent. The same behavior that had led Mason to the storage unit itself. Mason approached. The metal shelves appeared ordinary. Boxes, old supplies, dust. Nothing unusual, yet Shadow refused to stop. The dog shoved his nose beneath the lowest shelf, then looked directly at Mason, waiting. Mason crouched, carefully examining the area. A section of the wooden floor looked different, slightly raised, almost hidden beneath years of dirt and debris. His pulse quickened. He slid his hunting knife beneath the edge, pried upward. The board lifted. Beneath it sat a narrow compartment. Hidden. Deliberately concealed. Mason stared. Shadow whined softly. The dog seemed proud of himself. Inside the compartment lay a small wooden box. No label, no markings, only age. Mason carefully removed it. Dust drifted into the sunlight. The hinges creaked as he opened the lid. His breath caught. Photographs, dozens of them, older than anything he had seen so far. Some black and white, some faded with time, all carefully preserved. Mason picked up the first one. His stomach tightened. Two boys stood beside a lake. One looked about 8, the other 6. The younger boy was him. There was no doubt. The same eyes, the same smile, the same scar above the eyebrow. But that wasn't what shocked him. What shocked him was the expression. The child looked happy, truly happy, not posing, not forced, happy. Mason couldn't remember ever looking like that. Another photograph. The same boys sitting on a wooden dock, fishing poles in hand. Laughing. Another. Building a treehouse. Another. Playing baseball. Another. Standing beside a woman with warm eyes and dark hair. A woman Mason somehow recognized, yet couldn't place. A strange pressure built behind his eyes. His breathing slowed. Something felt wrong. Not with the photographs, with his memory, or the absence of it. He should remember these moments. He should remember the woman, the lake, the dock, the treehouse, the boy standing beside him. Yet his mind offered nothing, only emptiness. The sensation became increasingly unsettling, like discovering someone had torn entire chapters from your life. Mason flipped another photograph over. Writing covered the back. Summer 1971. Lucas and Mason at Lake McKenna. Mom couldn't get either of them out of the water. Mom. The word struck him harder than expected. His mother. He remembered almost nothing about her, only fragments. A voice, a scent, a vague image, nothing more. His throat tightened. Another photograph. Christmas morning. Another. A birthday party. Another. A camping trip. Years of memories. Years that apparently existed, yet felt completely foreign. Shadow settled beside him. The shepherd remained unusually quiet, watching, almost protective, as if sensing Mason's growing distress. Mason rubbed his temples. A headache was forming. The pressure behind his eyes intensified. Then something happened. A flash. Brief. Violent. A memory. A woman laughing. Sunlight through pine trees. a wooden swing, a little boy running. Then, darkness. The image vanished. Mason sucked in a sharp breath. The suddenness of it startled him. For several seconds, he simply sat there, frozen, trying desperately to hold on to the memory. But it was already gone, like smoke slipping through his fingers. Shadow immediately moved closer. The dog pressed against his side, grounding him, helping him focus, the same way he always did during PTSD episodes. Mason closed his eyes, steady breathing, in, out. Slowly, the dizziness faded, but the questions only grew. Why couldn't he remember? The photographs proved those moments happened. The evidence sat in his hands, yet his mind rejected them, buried them, erased them. A cold feeling settled in his chest, because military trauma wasn't the only kind of trauma that could damage memory. He knew that, had seen it before. Children sometimes forgot things for a reason, not because they wanted to, because their minds protected them. The realization made him uneasy. What exactly had happened? Why were these memories gone? And why had Lucas spent 18 years searching for answers? Mason continued digging through the hidden box. Toward the bottom, he found something else, a folded piece of paper, different from the photographs, newer, written in Lucas's handwriting. If you're reading this, little brother, then Shadow found the compartment. I always suspected he would. Dogs have a way of finding truths people miss. Mason smiled despite himself. Lucas had known about Shadow, had expected the shepherd to play a role. The note continued. These photographs are important, because they prove something neither of us understood for most of our lives. We were together. We were a family. And whatever happened afterward wasn't your fault. The words sent another chill through him. Whatever happened afterward. Not if. Whatever. Lucas clearly knew something. Something significant. Something painful. And suddenly, Mason understood. The answers weren't in the photographs. The photographs only proved the mystery existed. The real truth remained hidden, somewhere deeper inside the storage unit, somewhere Lucas had intentionally left waiting. Outside, afternoon sunlight began fading. Long shadows stretched across the abandoned mining camp. The mountains grew quieter, colder. Mason carefully gathered the photographs. His hands moved slowly, almost reverently. For the first time in his life, he possessed evidence of a childhood he didn't remember. Evidence that someone had loved him. Evidence that someone had missed him. Evidence that somewhere in the past, before the war, before the loneliness, before the mountains, he had belonged. But as he prepared to leave, another thought settled heavily in his chest. If those memories had disappeared, there had to be a reason, and deep down, Mason wasn't sure he wanted to discover what it was, because some truths healed, others hurt, and the next answers waiting inside Lucas's collection felt dangerous. The kind of answers capable of changing an entire life. Mason carried that feeling with him all the way back to the cabin. The photographs remained tucked safely inside his backpack. Every step through the snowy wilderness seemed heavier than before, not because of the weight on his shoulders, because of the weight in his mind. The mountains had always offered certainty. Simple problems, simple solutions. Cold weather, limited supplies, broken fences, storms. Those were things a man could understand. Family secrets were different. Memories were different. The past was different. Shadow trotted beside him as they climbed the final ridge overlooking the valley where the cabin sat. At least he did at first. Halfway down the slope, Mason noticed something unusual. The German shepherd had slowed considerably. Shadow stopped beside a pine tree and lowered himself into the snow. Mason frowned. "Come on, buddy." The dog rose again, but his movements seemed sluggish, heavy. Mason studied him for a moment. Shadow had always been tough, tougher than most people. Years of military service had forged resilience into every part of him. If he was showing weakness, something wasn't right. Still, after a short rest, the dog continued walking. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk had settled across the mountains. The temperature was already dropping. Mason unloaded his gear and started the stove. Shadow usually waited impatiently for dinner. Not tonight. The shepherd lay quietly beside the fire, watching, breathing a little harder than normal. Mason knelt beside him. His hand moved through the dog's thick fur. "You okay?" Shadow lifted his head. His tail moved once, trying, always trying. But something felt wrong. The feeling settled like a stone inside Mason's stomach. That night brought little sleep, not because of nightmares, because he kept checking on Shadow. The dog shifted frequently, drank more water than usual, rested his head on his paws, and stared into the firelight. The next morning confirmed Mason's fears. Shadow barely touched his food. The dog, who normally inhaled every meal, simply sniffed the bowl and walked away. Mason stood motionless. The sight unsettled him more than any storm, more than any memory, more than any mystery waiting inside Lucas's storage unit. Shadow. The shepherd looked up. His eyes remained gentle, trusting, but tired, very tired. The day passed slowly. Mason stayed close, watching, monitoring, the old habits from military life returning. Observe, assess, protect. By afternoon, Shadow seemed slightly better, enough to ease some of Mason's concerns. Then the storm arrived, without warning. Dark clouds rolled over the mountains, wind whipped through the trees, snow began falling in thick sheets. The forecast had missed it completely. Within an hour, visibility dropped to almost nothing. The cabin disappeared inside a wall of white. Mason secured the shutters, stacked extra firewood near the stove, prepared for a long night. Shadow remained near the fire, silent, still. As darkness swallowed the mountains, Mason sat beside him. The dog rested his head against Mason's leg. The familiar gesture brought comfort, a reminder that they still had each other, no matter what else changed, no matter what secrets waited inside the storage unit. Then suddenly, Shadow tried to stand. His legs buckled. The German shepherd collapsed. Hard. Mason was moving before the dog hit the floor. Years of SEAL training erased 61 years of age. He dropped beside Shadow, checked breathing, pulse, eyes, everything. The dog was conscious, but weak. Dangerously weak. Fear exploded through Mason's chest. Real fear. Not anxiety, not worry, fear. The kind that steals your breath. The kind that makes the world narrow to a single point. "Hey," his voice cracked. "Stay with me." Shadow's eyes met his, trusting as always. The sight nearly broke him. Mason grabbed blankets, wrapped the dog, added wood to the fire, checked him again, and again, and again. Hours passed. Nothing improved. Outside, the storm intensified. The cabin groaned beneath the wind. Snow buried the landscape. Yet Mason barely noticed. His entire world had shrunk to one German shepherd lying beside the stove. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. A battlefield years earlier. A wounded teammate. The same helpless feeling. The same desperate need to save someone. Mason pushed it away. Focus. Stay present. Help Shadow. Near midnight, the dog tried to stand again. This time he couldn't. His legs trembled violently, then gave out. That was enough. Mason made his decision. The nearest town sat nearly 15 miles away. Silver Creek, a tiny mountain community. The last place he wanted to go. The first place he needed to go. Because Silver Creek had something he didn't. A veterinarian. The storm eased slightly before dawn. Not enough. But enough. Mason packed supplies quickly. Food, water, blankets, emergency gear. Then came the hardest part. Carrying Shadow. The German Shepherd weighed nearly 80 pounds, normally manageable, not across a mountain during winter, not at 61 years old, not through deep snow. Yet Mason never considered another option. The dog had carried him emotionally for years. Now it was his turn. He lifted Shadow carefully. The shepherd immediately tried to resist, tried to walk, tried to help. Even sick, he wanted to protect Mason from the burden. Save your strength. Mason adjusted his grip. Shadow finally settled, trusting him. The journey began. Snow crunched beneath heavy boots. Wind cut across exposed ridges. The mountains tested every step. Hours passed. Mason's back burned. His shoulders screamed. Old injuries awakened. But he kept moving. One foot, then another, then another. The same stubborn determination that had carried him through deployments now carried him through the wilderness. Twice he nearly slipped on icy slopes. Twice Shadow somehow sensed danger. The shepherd growled softly, alerting him, warning him, even now, even weakened. The dog remained focused on protecting his human. By midday, they reached a narrow wooden bridge crossing a frozen creek. The structure looked unstable, half buried beneath snow. Mason stepped carefully. The old boards creaked. Halfway across, a section shifted, dangerously. Mason froze. Shadow immediately lifted his head. A low bark escaped him. Warning. Mason adjusted his weight, changed direction, found safer footing. The bridge held, barely. On the far side, Mason stopped to rest. His breathing came hard. His hands shook from exhaustion. Shadow nudged his arm weakly. The gesture made Mason smile despite everything. You always did have my back. The dog's tail moved once, a tiny victory. The afternoon sun hung low when Silver Creek finally appeared, a cluster of buildings nestled between snowy hills. Warm lights glowed through windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. Civilization. The sight felt foreign after years away. Mason stood at the edge of town, Shadow still cradled in his arms. People moved along sidewalks. Vehicles rolled past. Normal life continued. For a moment he hesitated. The old instinct returned. Turn around. Disappear. Go back to the mountains. But then he looked down. Shadow's eyes met his. Tired. Trusting. Needing him. The decision became easy. Mason stepped forward. Past the town sign. Past years of isolation. Past the walls he had built around himself. Toward the veterinarian's office at the far end of Main Street. Toward answers. Toward help. Toward a world he had spent years avoiding. And for the first time since finding Lucas's letters, the mystery no longer felt like the most important thing in his life, because no family secret mattered if Shadow wasn't there to help him uncover it. The veterinary clinic sat at the far end of Silver Creek's Main Street. Warm yellow light glowed through its windows. To most people, it probably looked ordinary. To Mason Reed, it looked like a lifeline, His legs ached from carrying Shadow through miles of snow-covered wilderness. His shoulders felt as if they were filled with broken glass. But none of that mattered. He pushed open the clinic door. A bell chimed softly overhead. Warm air immediately wrapped around him. The smell of antiseptic mixed with coffee and wet winter coats. It smelled like civilization, like a world he had spent years avoiding. A young receptionist looked up from behind the counter. For a brief moment, surprise crossed her face. Mason understood why. He probably looked like a mountain ghost. Snow-covered boots, gray beard, weathered face, heavy flannel coat, a large German shepherd cradled in his arms. "Please," Mason said. The single word came out rough. "My dog needs help." The receptionist was already moving. "Exam room 3. Within seconds, doors opened. Footsteps hurried down a hallway. Then a woman appeared. She moved with calm efficiency. Mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, kind eyes behind rectangular glasses. No panic, no judgment, just focus. "I'm Dr. Emily Carter." She knelt immediately beside Shadow. The shepherd attempted to stand, failed. Emily gently placed a hand against his shoulder. "It's okay, buddy." Her voice carried the confidence of someone who had spent years comforting frightened animals. Shadow relaxed slightly. That alone impressed Mason. Most people couldn't earn Shadow's trust that quickly. Emily examined him carefully, listening, checking, observing. The room fell quiet except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Finally, she looked up. "How long has he been like this? A couple days?" Mason hated how guilty the words sounded. Emily seemed to notice, but she didn't criticize him, didn't lecture him, didn't judge. She simply nodded. "We'll run tests." Mason swallowed. "How much?" The question hung in the air. Emily paused. Perhaps she'd heard that question thousands of times. Perhaps she already knew the answer before he asked. "We'll figure that out later." "No." Mason shook his head. "I need to know." Emily studied him for several seconds. Then she answered honestly. "Depending on what we find, it could be expensive." Mason looked down. That was enough. Expensive might as well have meant impossible. The cabin, the storage unit, the few dollars hidden in an old coffee can. None of it would be enough. Still, he nodded. "Do what you need to do." Emily smiled gently. "That's exactly what I intend to do." The next hour felt endless. Shadow disappeared into treatment. Blood tests, examinations, monitoring. Mason sat alone in the waiting room. For the first time in years, he had nothing to do, nowhere to go, nothing to fix, only wait. The experience felt strangely uncomfortable. Outside, snow drifted past the windows. Inside, Christmas decorations still hung from the ceiling, despite the holiday having passed weeks ago. Families came and went. Children laughed. Neighbors talked. Life moved around him. Normal life. Mason felt like an outsider watching through glass, a man who no longer belonged anywhere. Then Emily returned. Her expression was serious, but not hopeless. That mattered. Mason stood immediately. "How bad?" Emily motioned toward her office. "Come sit down." The office was small and welcoming. Bookshelves lined one wall. Family photographs lined another. A framed picture of a golden retriever sat beside a desk lamp. It felt lived in. Human. Emily sat opposite him. Shadow's chart rested between them. The good news is that this isn't immediately life-threatening. Mason released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Emily continued. The bad news is that Shadow has a serious kidney condition. The words landed heavily. Mason listened carefully. Years in the military had taught him to absorb information during stressful situations. Focus. Understand. Adapt. Emily explained treatment options, special diet, medication, regular monitoring. If managed properly, Shadow could still enjoy years of good life, but without treatment, the outcome would be very different. Mason looked away, toward the snow-covered street outside, toward a world he had abandoned. How much? Emily hesitated, then gave him the number. Several $100s immediately, more every month afterward. The amount felt impossible. His entire savings wouldn't cover much. Silence filled the room. Emily seemed to understand exactly what was happening behind his eyes. Finally, she spoke. "What do you do for work?" Mason almost laughed. The answer felt absurd. "Survive." Emily tilted her head. He realized how strange that sounded, so he explained. "Not everything. Not Lucas. Not the storage unit. Just enough. The mountains. The cabin. The years alone. The retired military life. The odd jobs when available. The isolation." Emily listened without interrupting, without pity. That surprised him. Most people either pitied him or feared him. She did neither. When he finished, she leaned back thoughtfully. "I could use help around here." Mason blinked. "What?" "We're short-handed." Emily folded her arms. "Cleaning kennels, repairs, deliveries, general maintenance." Mason stared. She continued. "The apartment above the clinic is empty." For a moment he thought he'd misunderstood. The offer felt impossible. "I don't think you understand." Emily smiled slightly. "I think I understand more than you realize." Mason shook his head. "I haven't worked a normal job in years. You carried an 80-pound dog 15 miles through a snowstorm." Emily's voice remained calm. "Most people wouldn't have made it 5. Mason didn't know what to say. Emily continued. "You obviously care about him." She pointed toward the treatment room. "And frankly, I trust anyone who loves a dog that much." The statement hit harder than expected. Simple, honest, no hidden agenda, no judgment, just trust. A feeling Mason barely remembered. For years he'd convinced himself the world didn't want him, that people only disappointed each other. That isolation was safer. Yet here sat a stranger offering help without asking for anything beyond effort. The realization unsettled him, because maybe he'd been wrong. Not about everything, but about some things. Later that evening, Emily brought him upstairs. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom, simple furniture, clean, warm, a place most people would overlook. To Mason, it felt luxurious, a real bed, running water, heat, windows overlooking the town. The sight made him strangely emotional. Shadow eventually emerged from treatment, tired, but improving. The moment the shepherd saw Mason, his tail began wagging. The simple sight nearly broke him. Mason knelt, wrapped his arms around the dog. For several seconds, neither moved. Just man and dog, together, as always. Emily quietly stepped away, giving them privacy, giving them dignity. Later that night, after Shadow had fallen asleep on a blanket beside the bed, Mason stood at the apartment window. The lights of Silver Creek sparkled beneath fresh snow. People walked the sidewalks, laughed, visited restaurants, lived their lives. For years he had watched humanity from a distance. Now he found himself standing among it again. Not fully, not yet, but closer than he'd been in a very long time. His gaze drifted toward the mountains, toward the darkness beyond town, toward the abandoned mining camp, toward Lucas's storage unit. The mystery remained. The photographs remained. The unanswered questions remained. But something had changed. For the first time since retreating into the wilderness, Mason no longer felt completely alone. And somewhere deep inside him, beneath the grief, beneath the confusion, beneath the memories trying to surface, a small spark of hope began to grow. He didn't know it yet, but that fragile spark would soon be tested by news far more devastating than anything waiting inside the storage unit. The next few days settled into a routine Mason had almost forgotten was possible. Mornings began with Shadow's medication. Afternoons were spent repairing kennel doors, hauling supplies, and fixing things around Dr. Emily Carter's clinic. Evenings ended in the small apartment above the building. Simple, predictable, safe. For the first time in years, Mason slept indoors without feeling trapped. The nightmares still came. Sometimes he woke sweating, convinced he was back overseas. Sometimes he saw faces he'd spent decades trying to forget. But now, when he opened his eyes, Shadow was there. And below them, life continued. People talked. Cars passed. Dogs barked. The sounds of ordinary existence slowly pushed back against the silence he had lived with for so long. On the fourth morning, Emily found him repairing a loose section of fencing behind the clinic. Snow glittered across the rooftops of Silver Creek. The winter sky stretched clear and blue overhead. Shadow rested nearby in the sunlight, looking stronger every day. Emily approached carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Mason. "How's our patient?" Mason looked toward the shepherd. "Acting like he owns the place." Emily smiled. "That's a good sign." For a few moments they stood quietly. The kind of silence that didn't feel uncomfortable. Eventually Emily spoke. "You mentioned a man named Lucas." Mason's grip tightened slightly around the coffee cup. The name always did that now. "I did." "Your brother, maybe." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You still don't believe it?" Mason stared toward the distant mountains. "I don't know what I believe." The answer was honest. Every day seemed to uncover something impossible. Letters, photographs, memories that weren't memories. A brother he couldn't remember. Nothing felt certain anymore. Emily leaned against the fence. "What if we tried finding him?" The suggestion hung in the cold air. Mason looked at her. For a moment he didn't answer, because part of him had already considered it. Every day. Every night. Every time he opened another letter. But another part feared the answer. Feared disappointment. Feared discovering that Lucas wasn't who he claimed to be. Or worse, that he was. Emily seemed to understand. "We can start simple." Mason frowned. "How?" "There are records." She shrugged. "Business registrations, property records, attorneys." The word caught Mason's attention. Attorney. Lucas had mentioned someone several times. A friend. A business partner. A man named Owen Brooks. Mason remembered seeing the name in several letters. Emily noticed the shift in his expression. "What?" "There was someone. Someone who knew Lucas?" Mason nodded slowly. Owen Brooks. Emily immediately pulled out her phone. The efficiency surprised him. Within seconds, she was searching. A minute later, she looked up. Attorney. Mason's stomach tightened. The feeling arrived suddenly. Sharp. Uncomfortable. As if some instinct buried deep inside him already knew what was coming. Emily frowned at the screen. "What is it?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, She looked at him, carefully, almost cautiously. Then she said the words, "I think we need to make a phone call." An hour later, they sat inside her office. Shadow lay at Mason's feet. Snow drifted lazily outside the window. Everything seemed strangely calm, too calm. Emily dialed the number. The phone rang twice. Then someone answered. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes. Mason listened, watched, waited. At first, Emily asked simple questions, then more specific ones. Her expression changed gradually. Concern, surprise, then sadness. By the time she ended the call, Mason already knew. The room felt different, heavier. Emily placed the phone on her desk. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Mason broke the silence. "Just tell me." Emily inhaled slowly. The pause felt endless. Then, Owen Brooks knew Lucas. Mason nodded. That wasn't surprising. Emily continued. "Very well." Another pause. "Lucas spent years looking for you." Mason stared at the floor. Part of him already knew that too. The letters proved it. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Lucas Reed died 3 weeks ago." Silence. Absolute silence. The words didn't register at first. His mind heard them, but refused to understand them. Emily continued gently. "Pancreatic cancer." Still nothing. Mason sat motionless. The office disappeared around him. The sounds outside vanished. The world narrowed to those 4 words. Lucas Reed died. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. Only 3. Not years. Not decades. 3 weeks. The realization struck with brutal force. If Shadow had found the storage unit sooner, if Mason had opened the letters sooner, if he had come down from the mountains sooner. 3 weeks. The difference between reunion and regret. His chest tightened painfully. For 18 years, Lucas had searched. 18 years. And after all that time, they missed each other by 3 weeks. Shadow lifted his head. The shepherd sensed the shift immediately. He moved closer, resting against Mason's leg, grounding him, keeping him anchored. Emily slid a folder across the desk. Owen sent this. Mason stared at it, didn't move. Eventually, he opened it. Inside was a photograph. Lucas stood beside a woodworking shop, older than the photos from the storage unit, thinner, tired, but smiling. A real smile. The smile of a man who still believed. Mason studied the image, trying desperately to connect the face to something inside himself, anything. But there was only grief, and a strange sense of loss. How could he miss someone he'd never met? The answer arrived immediately. Because Lucas hadn't been a stranger. Not really. A stranger wouldn't spend 18 years searching. A stranger wouldn't leave hundreds of letters. A stranger wouldn't build an entire trail of breadcrumbs hoping someone would someday find their way home. Emily quietly opened another document. Owen wanted you to have this. It was a copy of an obituary. Simple, respectful. Lucas Reed, beloved brother, craftsman, friend, community volunteer. Survived by his brother, Mason Reed, whom he hoped to reunite with. Mason froze. His name, printed there. Lucas had believed until the very end, even when dying, even when time ran out. He still believed. The office blurred. Mason looked away. Toward the window. Toward the snow-covered street. His vision felt strange. Distorted. He realized several seconds later why. Tears. The first tears in years. Not dramatic, not loud. Just silent grief. The kind that arrives when something precious is lost before you ever had the chance to hold it. Emily said nothing. She simply remained there. Present, respectful, giving him space. Eventually, Mason spoke. His voice sounded distant. He never stopped. No. Emily shook her head. He never did. Mason looked down at the obituary again. 3 weeks. The number repeated endlessly inside his mind. 3 weeks. The entire future he had begun imagining vanished. No reunion. No conversation. No answers from Lucas himself. No chance to hear him laugh. No chance to shake his hand. No chance to tell him he wasn't alone anymore. All gone. 3 weeks too late. Outside, the afternoon sunlight faded behind thickening clouds. The room darkened. Shadow pressed closer. The shepherd's warmth felt like the only solid thing left. Finally, Emily reached for another document. There is something else. Mason looked up slowly. He left instructions. What kind of instructions? Emily exchanged a glance with the papers, then answered, the kind someone leaves when they never stop hoping. Mason frowned. Emily handed him the final page. At the top sat the letterhead of an attorney's office. Below it, one sentence immediately stood out. If Mason Reed is ever found, contact him immediately, no matter how much time has passed, no matter the circumstances. The request was signed by Lucas himself. Mason stared at the signature. The handwriting matched the letters. The same careful strokes, the same steady lines, the same man. Gone now. Yet somehow still reaching toward him, still trying to guide him forward. And as grief settled deeper into his chest, another realization slowly emerged. Lucas had spent 18 years looking backward, searching for what had been lost. Now that responsibility belonged to Mason, because somewhere inside the storage unit, somewhere among the hidden records and photographs, the answers Lucas died trying to uncover were still waiting. And for the first time since finding the letters, Mason understood something with complete certainty. He wasn't searching for Lucas anymore. He was searching for the truth Lucas had sacrificed everything to leave behind. The morning after learning about Lucas's death, Mason barely slept. The grief sat heavily in his chest. Not loud, not explosive, just constant, like a weight he couldn't set down. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined a man he had never met, a man who had spent 18 years looking for him, a man who had died believing they might still find each other. 3 weeks. The number haunted him. 3 weeks. If Shadow hadn't become sick, if Mason had gone into town sooner, if he had opened the storage unit a month earlier. But those thoughts led nowhere. The past never changed. The only thing left was the truth. By sunrise, Mason had made a decision. He was going back to the mining camp, back to the storage unit, back to the answers Lucas had left behind. Emily insisted on coming. At first, Mason resisted. Old habits, old walls. But eventually, he nodded. Some journeys weren't meant to be taken alone. Shadow rode comfortably in the back seat of Emily's truck. His treatment was already helping. His eyes looked brighter, his movements stronger. Watching the German shepherd lift his head toward the passing mountains brought Mason a small measure of peace. The drive wound through frozen valleys and snow-covered forests. Colorado's wilderness stretched endlessly around them. Towering peaks, dark pine forests, silver rivers frozen beneath winter ice. The landscape looked beautiful, yet somehow lonely, just like the life Mason had built for himself. By mid-morning, they reached the abandoned mining settlement. The old buildings stood silent beneath a pale blue sky. Broken windows reflected sunlight. Snow drifted through empty streets. The place looked frozen in time, a forgotten piece of history, much like Mason's childhood. The storage unit waited exactly where they had left it. Rust stained the metal walls. The damaged door groaned as Mason pulled it open. Dusty sunlight filtered through cracks in the roof. Everything felt unchanged, yet completely different. Because now Lucas was gone. Every letter, every photograph, every clue. They had become final gifts. Emily helped organize the remaining boxes. Several were still unopened. One in particular caught Mason's attention. Legal documents. The label was written in Lucas's handwriting. Simple, direct, intentional. Mason opened it carefully. Inside sat folders arranged by date, birth records, court documents, property records, medical reports. The deeper he dug, the stranger everything became. Emily sat beside him, reading over his shoulder. The first shock arrived quickly. A birth certificate. Not Lucas's. His. Mason Reed. Born June 15th. Billings, Montana. Mother. Sarah Reed. Father. Not listed. Mason frowned. What? Emily took the document, studied it, then looked at him. Your father's name isn't here. Mason stared. That wasn't possible. His father had always been Daniel Reed. At least that's what he'd been told. Every memory, every document, every story. Daniel Reed. Yet the birth certificate said otherwise. No father listed. Only Sarah Reed. A strange feeling crawled through him. The same feeling he'd experienced while looking at the photographs. Something wasn't right. They opened another folder, and everything changed. Inside sat an amended birth certificate, issued 6 months later. This version listed a father, Daniel Reed. The name had been added later. Legally, officially. Emily looked up. He adopted you. The words landed like a hammer. Mason blinked. What? He wasn't your biological father. Silence filled the storage unit. Outside, wind whispered through broken buildings. Inside, Mason's entire understanding of his life shifted. The man he had called father. The man who raised him. The man whose surname he carried. Had adopted him. Why? Another folder waited. Mason opened it with trembling hands. Inside sat Lucas's birth certificate. The similarities were immediate. Same mother, Sarah Reed. No biological father listed. Then later, adopted by Daniel Reed. Mason stared. His pulse quickened. Lucas wasn't a half-brother. He wasn't some distant relative. They shared the same mother, the same missing father, the same adoption. They were brothers. Real brothers. The realization settled heavily over both of them. But it was only the beginning. The next folder contained court records. Thick, detailed, disturbing. As Mason read, pieces of a forgotten history emerged. A custody battle, protective orders, police reports, a dangerous man named Victor Holloway. The name appeared repeatedly. Victor Holloway, their biological father, a wealthy ranch owner, powerful, connected, violent. According to the records, Sarah Reed had fled him years earlier, taking both boys with her. She later married Daniel Reed, a kind man who adopted the children and gave them his name. For a brief period, they became a family, safe, stable, happy. The photographs suddenly made sense. The smiles, the lake, the treehouse, those memories had been real. Then Mason found the police report, the document that changed everything. His hands shook as he read. Date: July 1971. Incident: child abduction. Victim: Mason Reed, age 6. Suspect: Victor Holloway. The world seemed to stop. Emily quietly took the report, reading alongside him. Victor Holloway had violated a court order, taken 6-year-old Mason during the night, disappeared for 3 days. When authorities finally recovered the boy, he was severely traumatized, disoriented, confused, unable to recall much of his previous life. The report continued. Psychological evaluations suggested memory suppression caused by trauma. Mason sat back. The storage unit blurred around him, his missing childhood, the photographs he couldn't remember, the empty spaces in his mind. Suddenly, they made terrible sense. Someone had taken him. Someone had shattered his world, and his young mind had buried the pain. Emily's voice came softly. Mason. But he barely heard her. More documents waited. The next one explained what happened afterward. Sarah died only months later. Heart complications triggered by extreme stress. Mason stared at the death certificate. His mother. Gone. Not because she abandoned him. Not because she stopped loving him. Because she died. Trying to protect her children. The realization hurt more than he expected. For years he had believed he simply didn't remember her. Now he understood why. He had lost her, then lost the memory of losing her. The next document hit even harder. After Sarah's death, custody arrangements separated the boys. Lucas remained with relatives. Mason stayed with Daniel Reed. The courts believed separation would help him recover psychologically. No one intended permanent damage. No one intended to erase a family. But that's exactly what happened. Lucas grew up searching for the little brother who vanished. Mason grew up never knowing Lucas existed. Both victims of the same tragedy. Both carrying wounds neither fully understood. For a long time, neither Mason nor Emily spoke. The silence felt sacred, heavy, necessary. Eventually, Emily closed the final folder. What are you thinking? Mason stared toward the mountains. Snow drifted across the old mining camp. The sunlight looked colder somehow. I spent my whole life wondering why I never fit anywhere. His voice sounded distant. Maybe part of me always knew something was missing. Emily nodded quietly. Because now they both understood. The loneliness. The PTSD. The feeling of being disconnected from everyone. Not all of it came from military service. Some of it began much earlier, with a frightened 6-year-old boy, a kidnapping, a shattered family, and memories buried so deeply they disappeared for decades. Shadow suddenly stood. The shepherd walked across the storage unit, his nose working carefully, searching, focused. Then he stopped near a loose section of flooring. The dog pawed once, twice, then looked back at Mason, waiting. Mason slowly rose. His heart began beating faster, because Shadow had done this before, and every time, he found something important, something hidden, something capable of changing everything. And as Mason crossed the storage unit toward the waiting German shepherd, he had no idea that the most emotional discovery Lucas left behind was still waiting beneath the floor. Shadow scratched again. Once, twice, then stepped back. The German shepherd sat down beside the loose floorboard and stared directly at Mason, waiting. The same look he had given him near hidden trails overseas. The same look he had given him before finding the storage unit. The same look that always seemed to say, "Trust me." Mason knelt beside the dog. The wood beneath his boots felt slightly uneven. A section of flooring had been cut deliberately years earlier, hidden beneath dust and debris, almost invisible. Almost. Emily crouched beside him. "You think there's something down there?" Mason glanced toward Shadow. "I've learned not to ignore him." Carefully, he slid a pry bar beneath the edge. The old wood lifted with a groan. Dust floated into the sunlight. A hidden compartment appeared beneath the floor, smaller than the others, more carefully concealed. Mason's pulse quickened. Inside rested a metal lockbox, dark green, military style, weathered by time. A folded envelope sat on top. The handwriting stopped him cold. Lucas. For Mason. If you've reached this box, then Shadow did exactly what I hoped he would. A smile touched Mason's face despite everything. Even now, Lucas seemed to know the dog better than most people did. Emily remained silent, giving him space. Mason opened the envelope. Inside sat a small brass key and another note. "This is the last thing I left for you. The most important thing. Please listen before you judge anyone. Please listen before you decide what to carry for the rest of your life. Love, Lucas." The words felt strangely final. Mason unlocked the box. The lid opened slowly. Inside sat a digital voice recorder. Nothing else. No documents. No photographs. Just the recorder. The sight made his chest tighten. Because suddenly he understood. This wasn't another clue. This wasn't another mystery. This was Lucas. His voice. The brother he had spent his entire life searching for without knowing it. The brother who had spent 18 years searching for him. Emily gently touched his shoulder. "You don't have to do this now." Mason stared at the recorder, then slowly shook his head. "Yes." His voice cracked. "I do." Outside, wind whispered through the abandoned mining camp. Inside, the storage unit stood silent, frozen in anticipation. Mason pressed play. Static filled the air. A few seconds passed. Then a voice emerged. Older, warm, steady. A voice Mason had never heard, yet somehow recognized immediately. "Hello, Mason." The simple greeting hit harder than expected. His eyes closed. For the first time in his life, he was hearing his brother speak. "If you're listening to this, then I'm probably gone." The sentence landed heavily. Emily looked away, giving him privacy. Lucas continued. "I hate starting like that." A small laugh followed. Soft, human, real. "But I've spent enough time avoiding difficult truths." Mason listened, completely still. The world outside disappeared. "There are 1,000 things I wanted to tell you face to face," Lucas said. 1,000 stories, 1,000 questions, and probably 1,000 bad jokes. A faint smile touched Mason's lips, then vanished. "I spent 18 years trying to find you," Lucas continued. "Not because I needed something from you. Not because I wanted money or answers. I searched because I remembered you." Mason lowered his head. Emotion tightened his throat. "I remembered a little boy who followed me everywhere," Lucas said. "I remembered teaching you how to skip rocks. I remembered carrying you home when you scraped your knee. I remembered you stealing my sandwiches and blaming the dog." A weak laugh escaped the recording. Then silence. The kind of silence created by someone fighting emotion. "I remembered loving my little brother." Mason's eyes burned. The storage unit blurred. Lucas's voice softened. "The day you disappeared changed everything. I was 8 years old. I didn't understand court orders. I didn't understand custody battles. I didn't understand why grown-ups lied. I only understood that my brother was gone. Mason swallowed hard. The recorder continued. I searched every room of the house. I searched the barn, the woods, the creek. I thought maybe you were hiding. Maybe it was a game. The pause that followed seemed endless. When I finally understood you weren't coming back, Lucas's voice broke. For several seconds he couldn't continue. Neither could Mason. Shadow quietly moved closer, resting against Mason's leg. Steady. Loyal. Present. The same way he always was. Eventually Lucas resumed. I blamed everyone. Dad. The courts. Life. Myself, especially myself. His breathing sounded uneven, like someone remembering old pain. I kept thinking I should have protected you. I was the big brother. That's what big brothers are supposed to do. Tears rolled down Mason's face. He didn't wipe them away, didn't try to stop them. For years he had carried grief he couldn't identify. Now it finally had a name. Lucas. The recording continued. I need you to understand something. What happened wasn't your fault. It wasn't Mom's fault. It wasn't even Daniel Reed's fault. He loved us. He truly did. The statement surprised Mason, because anger had already begun forming, toward people, toward decisions, toward the past, yet Lucas seemed determined to stop it. He gave us a home. Lucas continued. He protected us. He tried to do the right thing. Life just became complicated. Mason closed his eyes. The voice felt almost comforting now, like sitting beside a campfire listening to someone tell the truth. No drama, no manipulation, just honesty. Then Lucas shifted. His tone softened. I wish you could remember Mom. The words struck like lightning, because deep down Mason wished that too. She sang constantly. Lucas said, terribly. A faint laugh, but constantly. She planted wildflowers everywhere. She cried during movies. She made the best blackberry pie in 3 counties. The smile returned to Mason's face, this time through tears. For the first time, his mother felt real. Not a faded photograph, not a forgotten memory. A person, a woman who had loved them. Lucas continued. She never stopped talking about you, not for one day. Even after you were gone. The grief returned, stronger than before, because now Mason understood. He hadn't been forgotten. He had been loved, deeply, fiercely, completely. The recorder crackled softly. Then Lucas spoke again. There's something else. His voice grew gentler. If you're hearing this, then you probably know I'm gone. Mason stared at the floor. The pain remained sharp, fresh, raw. I wish we'd had more time, Lucas admitted. I wish we could have sat on a porch somewhere, talked about life, argued about football, complained about getting older. Another pause. But life doesn't always give us what we want. The next words would stay with Mason forever. So instead of giving you my time, Lucas said softly, I'm giving you my future. Silence filled the storage unit. Even the wind seemed to stop. My ranch, my workshop, my savings, my journals, they're yours. Not because I owe you something, not because I feel guilty. They're yours because you're my family. Emily covered her mouth. The emotion in Lucas's voice was impossible to ignore. Mason sat frozen, unable to speak, unable to move. Then came the final part of the message, the part that shattered him completely. Mason! Lucas's voice grew weaker. Softer. I need you to forgive yourself. The words struck directly into wounds decades old. PTSD, survivor's guilt, the loneliness, the isolation, the endless self-punishment. Lucas somehow saw all of it. You survived, Lucas said. That's not something to be ashamed of. You survived, and now you get to live. Tears streamed freely down Mason's face, because no one had ever said those words to him before. Not like that. Not with understanding. Not with love. The recording approached its end. One last thing, Lucas whispered. If Shadow found this, a faint chuckle followed. Give that dog an extra steak. Emily laughed through tears. Mason did too. The image felt perfect. Somehow Lucas had understood the shepherd without ever meeting him. Then came the final sentence, the final gift. I never stopped looking for you, little brother, and no matter what happens next, you were never alone. The recording ended. Static filled the air. Then silence. Complete silence. Mason lowered the recorder. The world seemed different now. Sadder, yet somehow lighter. The grief remained. But something else had joined it. Peace. For the first time since discovering Lucas existed, Mason no longer felt like a missing piece. He felt found. And as Shadow rested his head on Mason's knee beneath the fading winter sunlight, Mason realized something important. Lucas hadn't left him money, or property, or answers. Not really. Lucas had left him something far more valuable, a reason to believe he deserved a future. For years, Mason Reed had measured life in days survived. Not dreams, not plans, not possibilities. Just survival. Get through winter. Find enough food. Keep the cabin standing. Protect Shadow, nothing beyond that. The future had become a luxury he stopped allowing himself. Now, sitting in the abandoned storage unit with Lucas's voice still echoing in his mind, Mason realized something had changed. For the first time in decades, tomorrow felt real. The drive back to Silver Creek passed quietly. Emily respected his silence. Shadow rested comfortably in the back seat. The shepherd seemed content, peaceful, as if his work was finally paying off. Mason occasionally glanced at him through the mirror. Each time the dog looked back. Steady, faithful, the same way he always had, the same way he always would. 3 days later, Mason and Emily drove north, toward the ranch Lucas had mentioned in the recording, toward the future he had left behind. The road wound through valleys framed by towering mountains. Snow-covered peaks pierced the clouds. Frozen rivers sparkled beneath winter sunlight. Colorado looked vast, wild, endless. Eventually they reached a narrow gravel road. A wooden sign stood near the entrance. Its lettering had faded with age. Reed Ridge Ranch. Mason stared. The name alone tightened his throat. This place had existed all along, waiting. The gravel road climbed through pine forests and open meadows. Then the ranch appeared. Mason stopped breathing. The property spread across a broad mountain valley. A large log home overlooked a creek. A red barn stood nearby. Pastures stretched toward distant hills. Smoke drifted lazily from a stone chimney. The scene looked like something from an old Western film. Peaceful, strong, timeless, beautiful. Emily smiled softly. Oh, Mason. He couldn't speak. Because this wasn't just land. It wasn't just property. It was evidence. Evidence that Lucas had spent years preparing a place for someone he believed would eventually arrive. Someone he never stopped waiting for. The truck rolled slowly toward the house. Shadow barked excitedly. His tail thumped against the seat. The German shepherd seemed to approve. A man emerged from the workshop before they even parked. Mid-50s, broad shoulders, weathered face, kind eyes. He removed his gloves and approached. "Mason Reed?" Mason stepped out of the truck. "That's me." The man's expression softened immediately. "I'm Jake Holloway." Mason recognized the name. Lucas had mentioned him. Business partner, friend, the man who helped run the woodworking company. Jake extended his hand. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Jake smiled sadly. "You've got his eyes." The simple statement nearly broke Mason, because for the first time, someone was looking at him and seeing family, real family. Jake looked toward the mountains for a moment, then back at Mason. He never stopped believing you'd show up. The words settled heavily between them. Jake led them inside. The ranch house felt warm, lived in, loved. Books lined the shelves, photographs covered the walls. A guitar rested near the fireplace. The scent of pine wood lingered in the air. Every detail seemed intentional. Every detail carried Lucas's fingerprints. Mason walked slowly through the rooms, almost afraid to touch anything. Photographs caught his attention. Lucas fishing. Lucas building furniture. Lucas smiling beside customers. Lucas standing with Jake. Lucas standing beside a large German shepherd. Mason stopped. The dog looked remarkably similar to Shadow. Jake noticed. His dog. Mason turned. Jake nodded. "Named Ranger." A smile touched his face. Lucas always had a thing for shepherds. Shadow approached the photograph and stared at it quietly, almost respectfully. The moment felt strangely emotional, as though one loyal dog was acknowledging another. Jake eventually led Mason toward the workshop. The building stood behind the house, larger than expected. Sunlight streamed through tall windows. Workbenches lined the walls. Tools hung in perfect order. Half-finished furniture rested beneath protective covers. The smell of fresh-cut wood filled the air. Mason stood motionless. The place felt alive, not like a business, like a legacy. Jake walked slowly through the workshop, running a hand across one of the benches. "He built all this." Mason nodded, silently. "He hoped you'd work here someday." Jake's words echoed through the room. Mason frowned. "What?" Jake smiled sadly. "Lucas talked about it constantly. He thought you'd like woodworking." Mason laughed softly. "I've never built anything in my life." Jake picked up a wooden box. Handmade, beautiful, smooth, solid. Neither had Lucas. Mason looked up. Jake placed the box in his hands. He taught himself. The statement lingered. Maybe it wasn't about experience. Maybe it was about starting. The next several hours passed in conversation. Jake shared stories. The kinds of stories only old friends know. Lucas volunteering at community events. Lucas helping veterans. Lucas mentoring young craftsmen. Lucas quietly paying bills for struggling families. The picture that emerged was remarkable. A man defined not by success, but by kindness. The more Mason learned, the more painful the loss became. And yet, the more grateful he felt. Because now he understood why Lucas had never stopped searching. Family mattered to him. People mattered to him. Connection mattered. Everything Mason had spent years avoiding. Late that afternoon, Jake handed him another box. Smaller, older. "This was for you." Mason opened it carefully. Inside sat several journals, handwritten, organized by year. At the very top rested a simple note. "For when you're ready, Lucas." Mason smiled through tears. Even now, even after everything. Lucas remained patient, never demanding, never pushing. simply courting. The sun began setting behind the mountains. Golden light flooded the valley. Long shadows stretched across the snow. Shadow ran through the pasture for the first time. Healthy, strong, free. Watching him brought a warmth Mason hadn't felt in years. Emily stepped beside him. The ranch glowed in the evening light. "What are you thinking?" Mason took a long breath. For once, the answer came easily. "I'm thinking maybe Lucas was right." Emily smiled. "About what?" Mason looked toward the house, toward the workshop, toward the valley that had somehow become his, then toward Shadow, the dog who had changed everything. "I've spent a long time surviving." His voice remained quiet, thoughtful. "Maybe it's time to start living." Emily didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth was already visible. In the ranch, in the workshop, in the dog racing across the snow, and in the broken veteran who finally looked toward the future instead of the past. As darkness settled over Reed Ridge Ranch, Mason stood beneath a sky filled with stars. For years he had believed he belonged nowhere. Now he stood on land left to him by a brother who never stopped loving him. A brother who had given him a home, a purpose, a future. And though the healing was only beginning, Mason could finally see the path ahead. What he didn't know was that 6 months from now, Shadow would uncover one final gift, a final message, and a final proof that Lucas had understood something long before Mason ever did. He had always been coming home. 6 months passed. Winter surrendered slowly to spring in the San Juan Mountains. Snow retreated from the valleys. Streams swelled with snowmelt. Wildflowers pushed through thawing earth. And for the first time in many years, Mason Reed welcomed the changing seasons instead of merely surviving them. Life at Reed Ridge Ranch had found a rhythm, a peaceful rhythm, one built on purpose. Each morning began before sunrise. Mason would step onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee, while Shadow sat beside him watching the mountains wake beneath golden light. The old Navy SEAL still carried scars. PTSD did not disappear overnight. Some nights the nightmares still came. Some mornings memories still hit without warning. But now there was something different waiting when he opened his eyes. A home. A reason to get up. A future. The woodworking shop had become the center of that future. Under Jake's guidance, Mason learned quickly. Perhaps Lucas had been right. Perhaps craftsmanship ran deeper than skill. Maybe it lived somewhere inside patience, inside persistence, inside the quiet determination both brothers shared. Furniture began leaving the workshop. Tables, cabinets, rocking chairs. Families across Colorado started placing orders. Word spread. Not because Mason was the best craftsman, not yet, but because every piece carried something rare. Care. The kind of care that came from a man rebuilding himself one board at a time. Shadow became the unofficial greeter of the ranch. Customers often met him before they met Mason. The German shepherd had regained weight. His coat gleamed again. His eyes sparkled with the confidence of a dog who knew he was loved. Visitors adored him, veterans especially, because they recognized something familiar. A working dog who never stopped serving, a loyal partner who refused to abandon his teammate. Many weekends brought unexpected guests, former service members, retired firefighters, ranchers, neighbors, people who simply wanted conversation. Lucas's ranch had quietly become something else, a gathering place, a refuge, the kind of place where people could sit around a fire and speak honestly. No judgment, no pressure, just understanding. Mason often found himself looking around those gatherings in disbelief. 6 months earlier, he had been hiding from the world, Now the world sat around his fire pit drinking coffee and sharing stories. One warm afternoon in early May, Emily arrived carrying a box of young saplings. Shadow greeted her halfway down the driveway, his tail wagging furiously. Emily laughed. "Nice to see you too." The dog nearly knocked her over with affection. Mason emerged from the workshop smiling, a sight that still surprised him. Smiling had become easier, more natural. Emily unloaded the saplings. "What are those?" Mason asked. "Memorial trees." She brushed dirt from her hands. "I thought we could plant them near the creek." Mason studied the small trees. Cottonwoods, aspens, ponderosa pines, each carefully chosen. "For Lucas?" Emily nodded. "And for everyone who helped bring you here." The idea settled warmly inside him. That afternoon, several friends gathered at the ranch. Jake arrived. A few local veterans joined them. Even Owen Brooks drove up from Durango, the attorney who had helped settle Lucas's estate. Together they carried the young trees toward a meadow near the creek. The location overlooked the valley. Beautiful, quiet, peaceful, exactly the kind of place Lucas would have loved. The work began. Shovels bit into soft spring soil. Conversations drifted across the meadow. Laughter occasionally followed. The atmosphere felt light, comfortable, healing. For once, grief no longer dominated Lucas's memory. Love did. Shadow wandered among the workers, occasionally accepting scratches behind the ears, occasionally chasing squirrels, occasionally supervising with the seriousness only German shepherds could manage. As the final tree was lowered into place, Mason stepped back. The row stretched along the creek bank, small now, but someday they would stand tall, strong, alive, a living memorial, the kind Lucas would have appreciated. The sun hung low in the afternoon sky when Shadow suddenly stopped moving. His ears lifted. His posture changed. Every veteran present noticed immediately. Working dogs never entirely stop working. Shadow stared toward a large pine tree near the edge of the meadow. Then he trotted toward it, purposefully, focused. Mason smiled. "What did you find now, partner?" The dog began sniffing around the base of the tree, then digging, not playfully, seriously, methodically. Within seconds, dirt started flying. Jake laughed. "Looks like he's after a gopher." But Mason wasn't so sure, because he had seen this behavior before, many times. Every major turning point in his life had started exactly this way. Shadow finding something, everyone else missing it. The dog kept digging. Soon he barked once. Sharp, intentional. Mason walked over. The others followed. Shadow stepped back, waiting. The same look, the same signal. "Trust me." Mason crouched beside the hole. Something metallic reflected sunlight beneath the dirt. His pulse quickened. Slowly, he brushed away loose soil. A small metal box emerged, weathered, old, deliberately buried. Silence spread through the group. Nobody spoke. Everyone understood. Lucas. Mason carefully lifted the box. His hands trembled. The lid was secured with a simple latch. No lock. No mystery. Just waiting. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for Shadow. Waiting for him. He opened it. Inside rested a single photograph. Nothing else. No money. No documents. No instructions. Just a photograph. Mason picked it up carefully. The image showed two young boys, one about 8, one about 6, standing beneath a tree, laughing, arms around each other's shoulders. Brothers. Lucas, And Mason. A moment frozen decades earlier, a memory rescued from time. Tears immediately filled his eyes. Then he noticed writing on the back. The handwriting was unmistakable. Lucas. Mason turned the photograph over. The group stood quietly around him, watching, waiting. The message was short, only one sentence. But it hit harder than everything that came before. I knew you'd find your way home, little brother. Mason stared at the words. Again, and again, and again. The mountains blurred. The trees blurred. Everything blurred. Because suddenly he understood. Lucas had never been searching for a missing person. He had been waiting for family. Waiting for healing. Waiting for the day Mason could finally believe what had always been true. That he belonged. That he mattered. That he was loved. Emily slipped her hand into his. Jake looked away, giving him privacy. Several of the veterans quietly wiped their eyes. Even Owen stood silent. The moment felt sacred. The wind moved softly through the newly planted trees. The creek whispered nearby. Birdsong drifted across the meadow. And somewhere inside all that peace, Mason finally felt the last piece fall into place. Not answers. Not closure. Something deeper. Acceptance. He looked down at Shadow. The German shepherd sat beside him proudly, tail sweeping the grass. Happy. Content. As if he already knew his job was finished. Mason knelt beside him, wrapping both arms around the dog. Thank you, partner. His voice broke. You brought me home. Shadow leaned into him, steady as ever, faithful as ever. The same dog who had led him to the storage unit. The same dog who had saved him countless times. The same dog who refused to stop searching when everyone else would have walked away. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and golden light flooded the valley one final time, Mason stood surrounded by friends, family, and the life he never believed he deserved. The lonely mountain man was gone. The broken veteran was healing. The lost brother had been found. And beneath the growing trees of Reed Ridge Ranch, Mason finally understood the lesson Lucas had spent 18 years trying to teach him. Family is not measured by years together. Love does not disappear because of distance. And sometimes the road home begins with the loyalty of one remarkable dog. For the first time in his life, Mason Reed no longer felt like a man surviving. He felt like a man living. If you believe family, loyalty, and perseverance still matter in this world, type yes in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Sometimes the people, or even the dogs, who stand by us through the hardest years are the ones who lead us home. And if stories about justice, dignity, and never giving up speak to you, consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey.